transfer portal in full-fledged activity. Tar Heels have had 2 gentlemen head into the portal, at least as of our discussions. No one coming in yet, although I would venture to say the Tar Heels will eventually get at least one player and maybe more coming towards the Tar Heels in the portal. Portal. So, Adam, 2 guys who we've had in here, James Okonkwo, Seth Trimble, both into the portal. Let's start with Seth. That's obviously the one that I think has been the most impactful for Tar Heel fans. And, I mean, there's 2 ways, I think, to think about Seth Trimble leaving. One, it is sad. We both like Seth Trimble. I think Seth Trimble liked Carolina. I think he enjoyed being a Carolina basketball player. He was obviously impactful when he was on the floor for the Tar Heels. His game had developed from year 1 to year 2. He was a better player this past year than he was as a freshman, which is totally to be expected. I think if it was 1987, you would be so excited that you could continue to see Seth Trimble mature and his game grow, and you knew he was going to be, in some form or fashion, a key player for Carolina for his entire career. All of that is accurate. Then there's the other part of this, which is that doesn't happen anymore. Seth Trimble is a good enough basketball player to start and play more than 30 minutes somewhere. That was likely not going to be Carolina, and that doesn't mean that he was that he somehow isn't a good enough player to play at Carolina. Does that make sense, Adam? He clearly is a good enough player to play at Carolina. Was he ever going to be a starter that played 33 minutes a game? I don't know. I think that would have been, you can't say that for sure. And since you can't say that for sure, and there are different options available now to players than there were in the past, unfortunately, this is not that big of a surprise. Even though Seth Trimble loved Carolina. Carolina fans, Carolina coaches, Carolina program love Seth Trimble. So you hate to see Seth Trimble leave as a person and as a player. And yet, in today's climate, I'm not sure it's that surprising.
Yes. And oftentimes there are other things influencing decisions.
Yes.
And so I think we have seen players go out through the portal, and we've been sad to see them go, but I think in many occasions they ended up about where they should be. And I know that it's easy for us to say this as we sit here, but there's Carolina basketball and then there's college basketball. And if you would rather play 32 minutes a game of college basketball rather than 20 minutes a game of Carolina basketball, that's okay. That's totally fine. People make that choice every single day, and it's not wrong or right. But it's also different. And the folks we've talked to who have made that choice have realized when they got to whatever their next destination might be, that it's very different. And I think sometimes when you just come to Carolina straight out of high school, you think, this is what college basketball is like. No, this is what Carolina basketball is like. You can go find out what college basketball is like, but it's going to be a little bit of a shock other than at about 2 other places. So it's just Seth Trimble, as you know, if you've heard him in here, great guy, very good player, was a huge asset to what this year's team was able to accomplish. Do I think he was playing pretty much the exact role he should be playing on this year's team? Yes, I do. I think one of the great things about Seth this year was how much he improved over the summer. Well, if you saw him improve that much over the summer, I think you also have to think probably Elliot Cadeau is going to improve from his freshman year to his sophomore year. So I think he will be a better player next year. By all accounts, Ian Jackson is a very good player. Certainly the Tar Heels hope R.J. Davis comes back. Well, that's a big crowd for a small number of positions. So in no way does it say anything bad about Seth Trimble that he can look at that depth chart just like we can and go, there's not a lot of minutes here. So go get those minutes. You have that opportunity now, but that also doesn't mean in any way that Carolina's not going to be just fine. And there aren't a lot of people who want to find out what's this Carolina basketball experience like.
I think that last part is, I mean, we say this every year. And I do think it's less this year than in the past because people are becoming more accustomed to the current climate of college basketball. And yet there's always going to be sadness, one, and then this little bit of panic, too, from the fan perspective of, oh my gosh, player X is leaving. We can never get anybody else to do what player X does. I've seen him do it. And all of that is a natural response. But I think it's important to remember there are a lot of basketball players out there. And Carolina is aware that it needs to have good basketball players. Like again, I don't want this in any way to sound like we're like negative about Seth Trimble or laissez-faire about Seth Trimble leaving. Like, I'd rather Seth Trimble be on the Tar Heels next year. But I bet Carolina is going to go find a player that is going to be on the Tar Heels next year that's probably pretty good at basketball.
I think the highest level of freakout last year was when Tyler Nickel left.
No, maybe. There was the moment, and this is another thing to remember about the portal. Remember, Caleb Love went into the portal, and Paxton Wojcik came to Carolina out of the portal like within an hour of each other. And everyone just thought, you're replacing Caleb Love with Paxton Wojcik? Well, Dean Smith wouldn't have done this. I mean, no, it's not a one-for-one trade either. It's not like the Tar Heels are now going, Hubert Davidson is going, Brad Frederick, Jeff Lebo, you must go find a defensive stopper immediately in the portal. He has to be 6'3" and be from Wisconsin. And like, it's not a one-for-one trade. And so, yes, there was. Caleb Love will be the all-time freak out, in my opinion, from fans of players going into the portal because of what he had accomplished and who he was and how big a role he had. And it was still early enough where people didn't understand. And I still think there's plenty of people who don't, and maybe not understand in the right way to put it, who still aren't comfortable with the way that the climate is with college basketball. And Adam, there is no doubt, and we said this last episode and we've said it many times before, it's not as fun to be a fan anymore unless the games are being played. And all of a sudden, when the games are being played, it's all coming back to me, Adam. Celine Dion, tell me, baby. It's all coming back because you love the games. And you're going to love the players. And you're going to love the atmosphere in the Smith Center. And you're going to love Carolina Duke and Carolina versus State and Carolina Virginia. You're going to love it all. It's hard this time of year to be a fan because you can't get it. Here's what stinks. You can't get attached to Seth Trimble anymore or your heart's going to get broken, Adam. And eventually people are going to have enough walls around them that you're going to lose that part of cheering for a team. And that stinks. But unfortunately, it is the way it is as of right now.
And part of the fun of being the fan was like, oh, Rayshon Terry's an all-ACC player now. I remember when he couldn't dribble.
I remember when old Rayshon couldn't even get off the bench.
And that's part of the fun of being a Carolina basketball fan, and you really don't have that fun anymore because every single year's team is independent of the previous year's team. But last year when all the freak out about Tyler Nickel, if Hubert Davis had called every fan personally and said, I know you're upset that Tyler Nickel's leaving, we're going to bring in Cormac Ryan.
Yeah.
Everybody
and by the way, he's going to score 31 points in Cameron against Duke. You cool with that?
Everybody would have been like, Tyler who? He did what? The Tar Heels could get Cormac Ryan? Yeah. I mean, that's how it is now. And there's no guarantee that it's going to work out that way this year.
Sure.
There will 100% be some years when it doesn't work out. That's what made this past year's team so special because they did fit together so well. So we're not saying, oh, don't worry, next year's team will be just as good as this year's team. Hubert Davis doesn't know that right now.
Right.
if we could just tell you the things we've heard. I mean, he's gotten calls from people, some who he's like, oh, that guy's a good player, and some who he's like, I don't know who this is. That's the time of year it is where you have to find out about these guys, get to know them in an extremely small amount of time, and then make a decision based on that about what's going to be best for the team, while also factoring in the decisions you're not sure about of the players who are already on your team, which makes it very difficult.
Adam, I do just want to mention, and we can continue to have an overriding discussion, James Okonkwo into the portal as well. And again, not a huge surprise. I don't think James Okonkwo played as much as he wanted to. Again, I don't think that his role was somehow not representative of what it should have been on the Tar Heels. I think Carolina had one of the better big guys in the country in Armando Bacot, and another big guy in Jalen Washington that has a very unique skill set and is got a very high upside that Carolina wants to continue to explore. So I think James Okonkwo was very valuable for the Tar Heels this year. He was a physical presence in practice. I think he filled that role very, very well. And yet I can't blame him for saying, you know what, I'd like a different role somewhere else. Again, it's rinse and repeat here. I think probably a different level than Seth Trimble, but James Okonkwo filled a very defined role on this year's team that was very valuable to Carolina. If he wanted a much larger role than that, it probably wasn't going to happen at Carolina, and that's okay. It's okay. If he was happy with that role, stay here. If he wanted a different role, go somewhere else. That's okay.
And the intangible quality about him is we'll never know how much going against him every day in practice, how much that helped Bacot and Jalen Washington. I think it's fair to say he made them better, which I think is probably what Hubert Davis had in mind him doing when he came here. And everybody's got to make their own individual decision. Do I want to go play more minutes somewhere else, or do I want to stay here and have pretty much the best of all worlds other than playing time? And he decided he would rather have playing time. That's your decision, and go get it.
Yes. I do think, Adam, and again, this is so hard to even have this discussion because no clue what Carolina's team will look like next year. None. I do think Carolina is losing some very good defenders. I mean, we know Seth Trimble is a very good defensive player. Armando Bacot was the best he's ever been as a Tar Heel defensively this past season. Cormac Ryan was very good defensively. And so Carolina is losing some good individual defensive players. So that will be something worth watching, I think, both in who does Carolina go after in the portal, and just several months from now, once the team starts taking its more final form shape, is how Carolina performs defensively. I think it was a huge part of what the Tar Heels were able to accomplish this year, as we discussed throughout the season. Some of that was the overall team ability and scheme, and some of that was the individual players. So just something worth keeping in mind and something that will be worth watching as next year unfolds.
And you just never know. Side note, if you didn't watch last week's Checking In with Hubert Davis, you never know who he might talk to over the summer. Of course, you all heard and watched that. But if you didn't, go back and listen, because I thought it was really informative about how he figured out something he thought his team needed to be better at, identified some people who were really good at coaching it, and went out and picked their brain a little. And so part of it is personnel, but as you said, part of it is scheme. On paper right now, yes, I feel like it would be easy to score against the Tar Heels.
Right. There will be some more players coming in. There might be more players going out. We don't know. It's not worth getting worried right now. And
I know we've talked about this in the past. This is going to happen at some point. Somebody's going to leave an important team, not necessarily Carolina, but a major college team in August. Because I think everybody sort of takes for granted that, once they say they're coming, they're definitely coming. Not really. You're not bound until classes start, depending on who you are. That's fall classes. This is going to happen at some point. Somebody's going to come for the summer, get mad about something, or get some calls from people who have great offers for them, and then decide they're peacing out. And so if you think the freak out is high in April, wait until everybody decides in July, okay, this is the team. And then in August, star X decides to go elsewhere. That's when people are really going to not understand how did this occur.
Just a couple more things. There have not been any public announcements by any other Tar Heels. I think it's fair to assume that R.J. Davis and Harrison Ingram both are going to explore professional options. They both said that. And R.J. Davis certainly as a senior. And then we'll see how all that shakes out. Harrison Ingram is moving up a lot of these mock drafts. So we'll just have to wait and see on those guys. And Adam, there certainly have been a lot of reports on players that Carolina has reached out to. Here's the good news. I think the Tar Heels have proven to be pretty good in their portal game early on in this experiment that we're all watching play out. And I do think Carolina's NIL game for men's basketball is strong, both in the resources available and the organization of said resources. So Carolina will be competitive in that arena, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean Carolina's not going to get in some bidding war for stuff. That's not who they are. And technically that's not is how it's supposed to work. Although we all know those rules are pretty blurred at this point. But I think Hubert Davis has made it clear he wants guys who want to be here and that he feels like would be a benefit to Carolina, just like Carolina would be a benefit to them. And so I think, in my opinion, he and his staff have earned that trust, even though I'm not saying every single portal player has worked out 100%, but I would challenge you to find a player that has come to Carolina through the portal that you just felt like, oh man, this guy makes absolutely no sense for Carolina to have him here. That they will be competitive in that arena for guys that Hubert Davis and his staff feel like, for lack of a better term, are Carolina guys.
I think in the short time the portal has existed, what we have learned is that every portal season, there will be some players who are going to whatever location gives them the biggest suitcase full of money, deliverable upon their arrival for their visit.
Which, by the way, is fine. That is the. Do we have to like that? No. Is that the climate that has been created? Yes.
Carolina's probably not getting those guys.
Right.
Because I don't think that's the type of NIL setup Carolina is running. But if you enjoyed seeing Elliot Cadeau on your TVs during the tournament and Armando Bacot and R.J. Davis doing stuff with Drake, which is pretty cool, those are the types of players that you are – I'm not talking about Drake May. That would be cool too.
Yeah.
Those are the types of players that I think Carolina has the best chance with, and the players who understand how to turn that into a potentially longer-term opportunity than just the suitcase that's shoved under the bed in the hotel that they check into on their visit.
Adam, anything else basketball-wise? I mean, UConn won the title. I think UConn was the best team this year. That's not breaking news.
We said that in December.
Yes. I do think Carolina could have been competitive with UConn had the Tar Heels played their best game. Carolina did not, in my opinion, play its best game against UConn in December. Carolina didn't play poorly that particular day, but didn't play great. Like if you got a Carolina versus Tennessee performance or the 2 games against Duke performance, I think Carolina could have been competitive and potentially could have won that game. What I believe to be true against UConn is you've got to be able to score. And I know that sounds very basic, but you got to be able to score. They were so good offensively, even if they had an off night, they were going to put up 75 points. So you weren't going to win a 63-61 type of game against them. It was going to have to be a high-scoring game, which I think Carolina had the capability of doing. if Carolina and UConn played 10 times, I think UConn probably, this year's version, wins probably 7 of them. But I think Carolina was capable of winning that game. And you, in speaking about something else earlier, said something that I think we all understand. Part of the reason why the Sweet 16 exit this year was disappointing was you did feel like this was a team that had a lot of the pieces that you aren't guaranteed to find anymore. They had older guys who wanted to win. They had players coming off the bench who understood what their role was and during the season were okay with that role. And that's not always easy to find. So all of that is to say, I think the best team ended up winning it. UConn certainly has had a remarkable 2-year run. They now have 6 titles, all of which have come in 25 years, which is very impressive. And off we go to the next year.
I would even say probably the 2 best teams played.
Yeah, Purdue was interesting in that obviously Zach Edey had a great year and was enormous and a good basketball player at his size. Their guards just didn't ultimately have enough for them to beat UConn.
And it felt like everybody kind of had a shortcoming. Like, I don't trust Houston because I don't think they can score.
Right.
And that's who they are every single year. Arizona looked pretty good when we saw them in person, but lost to Clemson.
Yeah.
So you can't put them on that tier. We don't need to talk about the other team at the Final Four. They're not on that tier.
Well, no. I mean, even, Duke had a good year. I don't think Duke was good enough to do that, to advance much farther than it did. Obviously, State got hot, but State wasn't – I mean, State should have lost to Purdue and would have lost to UConn. I mean, I think. And the most comparable team to Carolina in my mind was probably Tennessee as far as nationally. Like, I thought they were probably the most similar to Carolina. I think both of those teams could have put – again, if they were playing their A-plus game, I think those 2 teams could have defeated UConn. But it would have been a 87-83 type of game where you had to have some stuff go right. I'm just not sure there were a ton of teams. And I understand UConn lost some games in the regular season. That's the regular season. So they lost what? At Kansas, at Seton Hall, and at Creighton, right? And Kansas at the time was very good. Creighton was a good team. Seton Hall is a conference team on the road in like January, whatever. So Carolina, Tennessee to me were, and Arizona, I agree with you. I don't know why they lost that game. That they couldn't make anything. They couldn't make any shots. And so, I don't know. I think the best team ended up winning. You're right. I think Purdue was probably the second best team. I think Carolina, Tennessee, these teams had a chance, but probably ended up about what you thought.
Those teams plus maybe like Colorado State.
Yeah.
A team from the Mountain West.
Oh, right. The best conference.
Yeah.
So off we go, Adam, into another off season. Anything else about basketball before we move on?